There is a crisis of knowledge that we are all experiencing. It seems that nobody trusts what anybody else is saying. In politics and in the media, on social networks, there has been an increasing inability to discern truth. What causes us to explore conspiracy theories? How can we know when someone is telling a half-truth for political ends? And what is the way forward for Christians as we try to navigate a world full of information, but not a lot of wisdom? Our guest is Bonnie Christian. She is an experienced journalist who writes opinion pieces on foreign policy, religion, electoral politics, and more. She has a column at Christianity Today that I read regularly. She is also a contributing fellow at Defense Priorities, a foreign policy think tank. She was deputy editor at The Week. A graduate of Bethel Seminary, she lives in Pittsburgh with her husband and twin sons. Bonnie has written 3 books, the latest titled Untrustworthy: The Knowledge Crisis Breaking Our Brains, Polluting Our Politics, and Corrupting Christian Community. We're honored to have you with us on the podcast, Bonnie. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So, Bonnie, in the introduction of the book, you tell a few personal stories that explain why you felt the need to write the book. I think all of us can relate to one, if not all of these stories. Can you share with us some of these that really started this process of writing the book?
Sure, yeah. So one of them that I think is, I've probably heard something pretty similar to this story from a number of friends, which is that a friend of mine, her parents, after they became empty nesters, started watching a lot more cable news. And it's just really began affecting how they thought and like where their minds went in conversations that really didn't have anything to do with politics even. And so she'd be having conversations with them, in person or in the family chat or whatever. And they would start talking like Fox News hosts. And she was just baffled by this. And her siblings were baffled by this. And they just didn't really understand that this was not how their parents had been. They had always been politically aware, but they were never so fixated and just bringing it up out of nowhere. And so at first they would try like arguing with their parents and like trying to fact check them essentially and say, this is what you're saying is not right. Like that was misreported, et cetera. And it wasn't getting them anywhere. And so finally, my friend started, and she was pregnant at the time, and she would say a couple of things. One is she would say, like, why are you so angry? And then she would like remind them of her pregnancy and say, like, your granddaughter is coming, or like refocus them on things that were not what they were angry about. Like instead of trying to argue about that issue, she would refocus them on normal, good things in their lives. And her parents would sort of like reset and become themselves again and step away from that fixation that they were developing. And gradually they also started scaling down some of their news consumption as well, and didn't get caught up in those patterns so often anymore. And I think that latter happier part of the story is unfortunately maybe the part that people don't resonate with quite as much, because when I hear that story more often, it just ends at that point of anger and arguing isn't working and I don't know what to do. But then I'd also had similar experiences with some of my own loved ones that I was hearing from a lot of people, from readers, from friends, from acquaintances, and starting to think this is something that is happening in a lot of places. It doesn't always play out exactly along these generational lines. But this feeling that you and a loved one are not just disagreeing on policy, because that's something that happens. We disagree about politics, but like having such a different view of what the world is like and what we should be concerned about and what we should be spending our time on, and feeling like you're at an impasse in conversation. And that was a big push toward working on this project.
it's like you're talking to somebody and you're just talking right past each other because you don't even have the same language anymore.
Mm-hmm.
It's really crazy. And it's like, what happened to me or what happened to you? Either one of
Something's
us,
wrong.
both of us are not thinking the way we used to think. And so in the book, you identify this. It contains a big word. You call it an epistemic crisis. So what is an epistemic crisis?
Yeah, so epistemology is where that comes from. And epistemology is a branch of philosophy that is concerned with knowledge itself. So it's about what is knowledge? How do we acquire knowledge? How do we distinguish between true knowledge and something that we think is knowledge, but actually it's not? It asks these kinds of questions, and it's something that you might hear about, like in college, but it's not something that I think most of us think about it day in and day out. And it feels a little weird. Like I've likened it to, it's sort of like if you're trying to look at a mirror itself instead of the reflection, which is where you're inclined to look. So it's sort of a strange and difficult thing to think about. And what I've suggested is that in a lot of times and places, I think it would be fine to not know what epistemology means, to not think about, like, do we have an epistemic crisis? In many places and times that would be fine. But we live in such a chaotic and overwhelming information environment, and we encounter so much information all day long, a lot of it making major truth claims, that unless we're going to go full Luddite and just cut ourselves off from this, and I don't think most of us are, then we do need to think about epistemology and what that looks like in our lives, and how we need to be a little bit more deliberate about how we're deciding what we think is true and what counts as knowledge. And so to say that we're in an epistemic crisis is to say that we haven't done a good job about being deliberate like that. We've just sort of plunged into this situation, which came about pretty suddenly in terms of like rapid technological advances in the last 20 to 30 years, with the rise of first 24-hour cable news and then the internet and social media as we know it. We didn't really take care to prepare ourselves and sort of get our epistemic house in order. And so now we find ourselves in this sense of crisis where things are confusing. We're having these relational difficulties because we can't seem to talk to each other. We are frequently encountering claims that we don't know if they're true. And not only that, we don't have a good sense of how to decide if they're true. Right.
We can't agree about what we know. We can't even agree on how we know it. That's pretty frightening.
Yeah. And I think that's something that is very familiar to people at this point. You may not know the word epistemology, or you may not have heard the phrase epistemic crisis, but when it's described, I don't think I've ever had anyone say to me like, yeah, no, I don't know what that's not happening to me.
I don't know what you're talking about. I never experienced that. Nope.
So I feel like I have like a firsthand kind of knowledge with the social media world. Full time, I'm a social media manager, and I have told Bob this countless times. There's parts of social media that I think are redemptive and great, and it's helpful. And then obviously there's this side that you can go down a lot of deep rabbit trails and you don't know how you got there. What are some of these things that are leading to this big crisis?
Yeah. So, I mean, I take in many cases, fairly negative view of social media, but I mean, I'm also on there. It's not like I see nothing of value, obviously, because I do continue to use them, or at least some of them. I think that social media is tricky because it has a lot of the way that it works in terms of the business model, is it's all about maximizing the time we spend there and maximizing the amount of our attention it claims. And in that sense, I think the company's interests and our interests as the users are quite a bit at odds. That unfettered time spent on there is not good for us. But we know not only that that's their business model, but that they, in some cases, it's been like revealed from published internal documents that Facebook in particular did a study where they found that if they tamped down some of the more like politically exciting and divisive and fear and anger inducing content in their algorithm, that people spent less time on Facebook. And so then they were like, well, clearly we can't tamp that down because we need people to be here. And so they're deliberately making those choices that go against, what I would say is sort of like an appropriate use model for us as the users. There's also plenty of fault to be laid at our feet as users. A couple things that I would highlight to that end are, you mentioned sort of like the political groups and tribalism that plays into it. That's a big part of it. Encountering truth claims and information, news reports, whatever, on social media. And this point is not original to me, but reading things and watching videos in the context of social media is not like sitting at your kitchen table and just reading a newspaper article by yourself, because you're hearing it in that social context, in the context of your tribe, and that's encouraging you to have a reaction that you might not have if you were just sort of evaluating the information sort of alone with your mind quiet. Instead, you're reading it thinking about, like, what am I going to respond? How am I going to post? That creates a very different reading experience, a very different way of encountering knowledge and deciding what you think is true. And related to that is the way that social media, for the most part, for most of us, tends to mix a lot of different kinds of content together. And so you are seeing first, your cousin's cat, and then a story about a genocide, and then your sister's cute kid, and then like, here's a great crime that someone has committed, right? And so you're being jerked from one emotion to the other, from the silly to the serious, and back and forth and back and forth, and you can't give anything like the consideration it deserves. You can't approach serious matters seriously, and so it just creates like this moral and intellectual confusion that I think is very, very difficult to overcome. What
you just said, it reminds me of The Social Dilemma, if you've seen that on Netflix. And
I have. It's been a while though.
Yeah, I highly recommend it if you're listening to go check it out. I felt torn because, like I said, I do it full time. But when I watched it, I was like, yeah, how is Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and all of them able to be free to you to sign up and use? Is because you are the product. They are selling ads to you. They're pushing different things that larger companies or groups are putting paid dollars behind. That's how the algorithm works. How do we discern? And this is kind of a big question, but how do we discern what is truth versus lies? I mean, what's a step that we can take to discern while we're scrolling on social media?
For me, something that I found helpful is I'm pretty much not active on Facebook anymore. I have like a professional page where I post links to articles I've written, but I don't scroll the newsfeed anymore. And the reason is that Facebook makes it impossible for me to separate out those different kinds of content, right? Like the way their algorithm works, they're always throwing in recommendations to stuff. You can't just get one thing or the other. So the two social networks that I use most often, almost exclusively these days, are Instagram and Twitter. And I have two of them. Instagram is purely personal stuff. There is no politics pretty much in my Instagram feed, to the point that if I have a friend who is starting to regularly post about anything political, honestly, anything that's not just their lives, they typically tend to put it in their stories section, those short posts that disappear after 24 hours. I unsubscribe from their stories because that's not what I'm there for. When I'm on Instagram, I'm not in a mental space to like weigh truth claims and decide what is true. I'm there to look at your cat. And then Twitter is where I'm there to look at political things and like to have my mind engaged and to be thinking about things critically and seriously. So on Twitter, I'm not typically there to socialize. I'm not there to look at your, like cute pictures or whatever. I'm there to like think about what I'm encountering in a more professional mode. And for that reason, that's part of why you can definitely go find times in my record on Twitter when this was not the case. But generally speaking, I'm trying to not be on Twitter outside of work hours on nights and weekends. And so I don't think there's really a good, like big sweeping rule to offer to say like, here's how you're going to distinguish, because there's just too many cases, right? There's too many situations where I can't give any sort of blanket rule to say, here's how you can tell what's true or not. What we can do, though, is think about these limits on how we're spending our time, where we're putting our attention, what emotions we're being jerked between, what voices we're allowing to speak to us and when. And those moves toward order and toward clarity and toward better habits, I think can make it a lot easier to make those individual determinations about what's true and what's not.
Yeah, I really wish that there was just a blanket statement that we could just say, here's ABC and you're good. You'll
That
only
would be
see
nice.
truth.
If it has my byline, it's true.
There you go.
There you go. That's how
that
you
helps
decide.
a
That's
lot.
the answer.
But yeah,
Like I would say the goal is not 100% certainty that you're always going to know for sure. Like I think there will be times where you'll come across something and just have to say like, I am just not sure about this one. And I'm sort of like, I'm not going to integrate that into my core belief systems because I don't know. But to sort of pay attention to the environments we're putting ourselves in and what kind of people we are coming into those environments, those are things that we can do much more reliably.
Well, we've all experienced it. A friend in a church or a family member tells you about others, a evil cabal of people in government and in the media who secretly do sex trafficking and are Satan worshipers, hell set on world domination. They want to control us all. And that's why they mandated masks during the pandemic. So some don't even know where they got these ideas, but we believe these conspiracies started with QAnon. Why are we all, not just those we think are loony, but all of us, why are we all so susceptible to believe in conspiracies?
QAnon's a really interesting thing. It's not quite as getting as much attention as it was a year ago, but it's very malleable and it's sort of still lurking there and pops up from time to time. And a lot of people, even if they don't know the name, do still believe pieces of it or large parts of it. As far as why we're susceptible to it, I think that there's a number of answers. Some more sympathetic than others. Well, for one thing, there conspiracies do happen sometimes. So anyone can point to like, here's a thing that really did happen, and people said it was a conspiracy theory, and it turned out to be true. So yeah, they do happen sometimes. Yeah. I think a lot of times it provides a very satisfying and sort of tidy explanation for the world, right? Where instead of saying like, well, things are bad because we have this complex system of poorly made laws, and you have sort of petty bureaucrats who are making lazy, self-interested decisions and all these sort of complex things that are not going to be easy to fix and probably won't be fixed in our lifetimes. You can say, look, there's these 15 to 20 really bad people. They're pulling the strings behind the scenes. If we can expose them and throw them in jail or maybe execute them, it's done. It's good. Everything will be right again. And that sounds very achievable and very good. And you can feel like by knowing, quote unquote, the truth, you're helping with that. And so that's all really appealing. And then one thing that I think is new, and QAnon is a good example of this, something that's new with the internet age, is that we tend to think of conspiracy theories as like the X-Files, and it's like one or two guys down in their basement and they've got the big complicated map. But the internet has allowed those people to all find each other and to build communities and to have like real friendships. And so especially if you have someone who maybe doesn't have a great community in real life, then they start getting pulled into these ideas. And it's not just the appeal of the ideas themselves, it's the appeal of friendships. That becomes very attractive, and that itself becomes part of it. And so even if the story doesn't even really hold up, even if there's no proof, there's no clear storyline, it's constantly changing and just adapting to whatever happens in the news, you still have that through line of community. And that I think becomes really powerful. And that's something that is pretty novel. Not that people didn't get on like mailing lists and trade VHS tapes before, right? But this ability to instantly connect and form those thick bonds that they may not have in real life is a powerful thing, and something that I think creates a durability in these conspiracist movements that we did not have before.
So what's the difference between conspiracy theories, and conspiracism?
Yeah.
You use that word, conspiracism. I think that's very helpful.
Yeah, it's one of my pet peeves as an editor when people use conspiracies when they mean conspiracy theories. So a conspiracy is the actual act of people conspiring together. Like the conspiracy is the plot. So to use like Watergate, for example, the conspiracy is what Nixon and his guys did. Like they planned to go and tap the Democratic offices. That was the conspiracy. Conspiracy theory is people who are outside of that plot saying, I think this plot is happening. So, had it, usually theory suggests maybe a lack of universally accepted proof. So you might say, like, at the very beginning of their investigation, Woodward and Bernstein were engaging in some conspiracy theorizing about Watergate. Now, they collected the proof, right? So it didn't stay in the realm of theory. It became a matter of publicly accepted knowledge.
Right.
Conspiracism. So sometimes conspiracies happen. Sometimes conspiracy theories are right. I think more often than not, they're not right. But sometimes they are. Conspiracism is, I think, much more troubling than holding a single conspiracy theory. It's not just a single story. It's a mindset where there's a pair of political scientists whom I cite in the book, who call it conspiracy without the theory. It's a very cynical way of thinking. It doesn't need the details. It doesn't need that web of proof. It just is a bunch of sort of allegations. It's innuendo. It's, well, we know he's bad, so of course he's doing it. It's much more, in its modern incarnation with the internet, it's much more communal. It's much, I think, sloppier, lazier. The classic conspiracy theorist, he may be a crackpot. His evidence might not be good, but he's trying to piece together this evidence to construct this theory. Conspiracism doesn't really need to bother with that. It assumes guilt and will stay convinced of guilt, even if every piece of supposed evidence is knocked down one after the other. There'll always be just some new assumption. And so that, much more than discrete conspiracy theories, I think, are what contributes to epistemic crisis. Like, I don't think it's that big of a deal if someone thinks that, like, the moon landing was fake. I think, like, they're probably wrong, but also not a big deal in the grand scheme of things. But if you have a conspiracist mindset where you're just sort of like automatically assuming you'll believe anything bad about the people you already dislike, well, that's much more poisonous, and that's going to be a real impediment to knowing the truth at a much broader scale.
It seems like the conspiracism, it just kind of layers itself. And if you believe this conspiracy over here, you're going to more likely agree with this conspiracy over there, because they generally attack the same people that you are already either afraid of or dislike or hate. I love the phrase you often hear is like, well, you need to do your own research. And what they mean is, go to InfoWars or a YouTube video and they'll find out all you need to know about the real truth.
Yeah. And I mean, I think that's a real tell, right? Because the research in question is read, this article or watch this YouTube video of someone else's purported research. So it's not even your own research. It's usually not research. It's just allegations. And that's very different from, like, I don't know, getting a hold of classified government documents. Like, I would have some respect for you building a conspiracy theory based on these documents you've acquired, based on you talked to Deep Throat in the parking garage, right? But watching a YouTube video is not research. That's watching a YouTube video.
As a kid, I really looked up to journalists. My dad loved journalism. I loved journalism. Every journalism TV show or movie, I just love. The true story of Woodward and Bernstein is one of my favorite movies. So it's like, to me, journalists were always like, we got to check our facts. We have to be sure that we have people that can back those things up, more than one source and all this kind of stuff. And then these guys on the internet, they can just say anything they want. But today, nobody really trusts any journalism. So what's causing that problem?
Some of it is very sort of basic business problems and internal industry debates that are visible to the public in the way that things happening in other industries are not. So on the business side of things, like, it's still very much an open question for journalism. Like, what is the business model now that the ads money is just not there? You can't you can't get money off classifieds the way you could before Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace. There's nobody's going for job listings in the paper anymore. That's not where you sell your house or your car. All of these things have been replaced. And of course, no one wants to pay for subscriptions because we have this mindset that like a paywall is a personal offense and everything we would never expect a physical newspaper to be free, but everything online should be free to us. And so those real financial pressures create a lot of pressures on journalists to figure out like, how are we going to pay the bills? And the responses to those pressures are not always the greatest. It frequently looks like churning out more content than we should be making in given time constraints, making it more exciting, more geared toward entertainment, even sensationalized than it should be, because there's that desperation to get eyeballs, to try to get some money. Because journalists also need to have salaries. And the public sees that, and like the more discerning readers are like, yeah, this isn't what this should be. I think there's also part of it is there is an ongoing like debate within the industry of what should our relationship to objectivity and truth look like. And so you have sort of an older breed of journalists, and I write opinion. This is much more about like the reporting side of things. You have an older breed of journalists that wants to strive for that sort of mid-century, very neutral voice, that ideal of objectivity. And then you have, again, and this is gross generalizations, but a younger breed that tends to want to say like, no, we know what the truth of this situation is. Why are we pretending that it's neutral? Why are we pretending that there's two reasonable sides here when there's only one? And so like a classic example of the way that debate would play out specifically is if a politician makes a racist comment. Do you say in the headline, he made a racialized remark, or do you say he made a racist remark? The older model would say you call it racialized, and then you interview someone who was racist for you. The newer model would say, no, we know it was racist. It was clearly racist. Just call it racist in the headline. And both types, both models are out there. And so, that's again something that all plays out in public. And then one other thing I point to is journalists make mistakes like anyone does. When your incompetent coworker makes a mistake, the people in your office know about it. When our incompetent coworkers make a mistake, it's preserved on the internet forever. And that is, that's what people remember. And so I would by no means say like all journalists are doing perfect work or that there's nothing wrong with the industry. Like I just detailed some problems with the industry. But the sort of critiques that people tend to make, and we have polling on this, which is that the average American thinks that what's wrong with the media is journalists deliberately lying for ideological reasons, typically because the way this is typically story is typically told is that they want Democrats to win elections. That I think is very off base and is just mostly not what's going on.
What you said makes me think of like specifically on Twitter. That's where I get some of my news as well, and then also just different even sport updates. And I've seen a lot of different reporters like, come out with something because they want the story quickly. So they come out with something, they publish it, and then something fell through, like the athlete's deal fell through. So then they have to like kind of walk it back,
go do an update. Yeah.
And do an update. And then everyone blows it up and says, how could you, run with this? And that is kind of a lot of times what feeds, and then people run with that first story, and then it can trail off into a whole topic on social
and it's
media.
Messy because sometimes you make the correction and that's what you should do, but more people see the original incorrect report than see the correction, and sometimes the original report was made in good faith, and sometimes it was a little reckless and shouldn't have been made. Like it's just all out there. And so like you think back to 70 years ago, you make a mistake. The next issue of the paper, they print a correction. In 3 days, 99% of all the copies of both issues are in the garbage, and it's done. Now it's there forever. And some people believe the wrong thing forever, and they'll point to it endlessly on Twitter and say, no, look, here's what they said. And it's like, well, but there's a correction, but no, look what they said. Like, it's very messy.
People that, quickly run to Google when they look something up. If this is how the algorithm is working, if this is how the articles that are getting pushed to the top are working, obviously can run into some issues. So you cite that 15% of Americans believe major QAnon beliefs. But then you cite studies that reveal something much more startling, which is that white evangelical Christians believe QAnon things as high as 50%, and that half of American pastors in 2021 reported frequently hearing conspiracy theories from their congregants. So why do you think Christians are more apt to gravitate towards some of this?
Yeah. So two things I would say. First is that the distinction that this is mainly among like white evangelical Protestants, that distinction does matter because we know how many of them tend to be Republicans, and QAnon is something that has largely flourished in Republican circles. And so there's a lot of questions where people will say, like, why are the white evangelicals doing X? And the answer is because Republicans are doing X and white evangelicals are overwhelmingly Republican. And that's part of the situation here, that this is a conspiracy theory that largely is on the right and largely takes Democrats as its targets. And so in terms of people who are politically predisposed to, find this plausible, we're going to look at Republicans and therefore we're going to look at white evangelicals. But the other thing I would say that's more specific to evangelicals, you could say to Christians generally in some cases, and in some cases to evangelicals particularly. One is that we're already very used to thinking about that there being this bigger purpose, that we would have a role to play in this bigger purpose. And QAnon specifically, and a lot of conspiracist thinking generally, fits really neatly onto that mindset. QAnon has basically like an eschatology. It has like an end times. Like it has a story of how someone, probably Trump, is going to defeat all these bad people and they're going to be executed. And then there's going to be like this wonderful time where everything is good. And like America is as it should be. Like it's an almost a new earth, new heaven and new earth type story. And so, I don't think people are consciously making that comparison, maybe, right? But that sort of model of story makes a lot of sense to Christians. And QAnon in particular explicitly took advantage of that and would like quote, often very inappropriately and out of context, but would quote Bible verses to try to signal like I'm one of you. And so when you combine that with like already this political comfortableness and this sense of like, yeah, a big plan and a big fight between good and evil, like that all makes a lot of sense. It seems to fit. I also think for evangelicals specifically, and especially those of the boomer generation, folks who were coming of age in the 70s, that was a time when a lot of real conspiracies were exposed, like things that actually happened and that were exposed by very credible sources, like congressional investigations, like very well documented journalism. All of this stuff came out. And it was also the decade in which books like the Late Great Planet Earth, which was a book about the end times that was very much about reading the events of the day, like reading the headlines into scripture and vice versa, and saying like, okay, this is the Antichrist, Russia represents, it's all very complex. Like Armageddon is going to happen here. Here's what it means that Russia and Israel are doing this and that. And so if that's your formative decade, that was like the bestseller of the decade. And there were a lot of books that like it spawned lots of imitators. So if on both like the political side of things with these investigations and then books like that at church, if that's your formative decade, that's where you come into politics for your first 10 years. That sets you up for life, I think, to think about politics that way, to be looking for conspiracies, to be adopting that habit of reading scripture and headlines in light of each other and trying to figure out like, who is this political figure in God's plan to end the world? And so that mindset, it's very well intended. It has a basis in some actual reality. It is often fueled by like a sincere love of scripture, but it taken all together, it can lead to this conspiracist thinking, which isn't actually grounded in anything very careful. It never comes up with the proof that those investigations in the 70s have. And of course, the Late Great Planet Earth strongly suggested to its readers that the world was going to end in the 80s, and it didn't. And yet that approach of looking for the end times and every new turn of political events hung on, even though all of the specifics were false.
Not only that generation, but everybody now has become skeptics about everything too. It's like what we saw, especially in the pandemic, we saw science being done in real time in the media. And so it's like we wear masks. At first there's like, nobody should wear masks. And then they said, everybody should wear masks. And then it's like back and forth. And to most people are like, well, see, science, you can't trust the scientists. They're all crackpots. And so there's this cynicism / skepticism about science and about expertise in general. Can you talk about what we can do about how to properly deal with expertise in a way that isn't cynical, but can be proper?
Yeah, it's tricky to talk about expertise right now because, as you say, a lot of the experts did not comport themselves well during the pandemic. And the thing about like masks early on, where they said, don't buy them, you don't need them. And then openly, like pretty much admitted, well, that was a lie because we needed to conserve them for the healthcare workers. And then, there were other examples where Anthony Fauci in particular came out and explicitly confessed and said, he said in an interview with the New York Times, originally I said herd immunity was like 60%. And then I saw people were getting the vaccine and I thought I can nudge this up. I can nudge it up to 70, 80, 90%. And it's like, you can't just lie and then admit that you lied and expect people to still trust you. And so against that backdrop, like, I do understand where people get to be so cynical about expertise. The problem is that we live in far too complex of a society to do without expertise. We can't operate without trusting expertise, and crucially, expertise that we have no way of personally evaluating. I mean, every time you hire a plumber, every time you drive across a bridge, every time you go to even like your personal doctor who you trust, unlike people in government or whomever, you're trusting expertise that you can't evaluate because you don't have the knowledge and you don't have the time or wherewithal to get the knowledge you would need to evaluate all those people's expertise. We just have to trust each other and rely on expertise. And that just is what it is, unless we want to go back to like terrible pre-modern life with no plumbing. And so on the one hand, some of our problem is the experts need to handle themselves better. They need to, not be sort of treating the public like children who can't handle difficult truths. They need to be willing to admit when they got things wrong and not like come out and sort of brag about the clever little lies they told and not publicly disobey the rules they're making for everyone else. We saw a lot of that during the pandemic as well. But I think, again, there's a lot of fault with the public here too, where we can't do without expertise, and we can't lapse into this very convenient cynicism where whenever someone with expertise tells us to do something we don't want to do, we just, dismiss them and say like, well, why should I trust you? And so you mentioned during the pandemic, we saw science being done in real time. And I think that that's something that's very difficult for people to watch. I don't know that it's a great thing, frankly, for scientists to be having their debates and giving us every little update on Twitter and, going on cable news and talking about things when maybe they're legitimately good scientists, but they're not good at it being a talking head. Like, these are very different. Being bad at talking does not mean that you're bad at science, and likewise, being good at science does not mean you're good at talking. And like, the public needs to be willing to give a certain amount of grace, again, not for deliberate lies and manipulations, but for honest error and for gains in knowledge. I mean, we should not be playing gotcha when experts come out and say, oh, we've realized we were wrong and this is actually the better thing. We should be like happy that they are engaged in a self-correcting process and giving us updates.
Isn't that even the definition of science?
That is how it's supposed to work. And like, maybe they could take some better PR advice and not give us every single update so that, it looks a little smoother, because we don't have the technical knowledge to follow all of those steps anyway, right? Like, there are things that they could do better, but this is very similar to what we were just talking about with QAnon, which is that you watching a YouTube video, even if the expert sometimes gets things wrong, your research on YouTube and Wikipedia is still not better. We still do need that actual expertise. And again, the difficult reality is a lot of times we do just have to trust people who have the education, who have the peer recognition. We have to take their word for it, that even though they are sometimes wrong, that does not make our uneducated guess better. Like, their failure does not make us right.
You told a quick story in the book where a student argues with the professor, and the student says, well, I guess it's anybody's guess. The professor says, no. My educated guess is much better than your educated guess.
Yeah. And I mean, I think we have like this strong egalitarian impulse, and we want to say like we're all equal, and you know, my opinion is just as good as yours, but the reality is it isn't. There's a lot of things where my opinion isn't as good as someone who knows a lot more about it than I do, and I think we recognize that in things that have swift practical consequences, like I'm going to find out real quick if I've unduly trusted my own knowledge about like my house's electrical system over the electrician's expert knowledge. But with politics, there's no immediate backlash, right? Like, my house doesn't burn down if I write someone off as a dummy and think that I know better. There are consequences. There's consequences to like how we think, and maybe eventually what kind of people we are and what kind of relationships we're having with people. But it's because it's not that immediate feedback to our physical safety, I think we can get away with our nonsense a lot longer.
What can we do to differentiate between truth and knowledge, opinion, and conjecture?
These days, epistemology, especially in the academic sense, tends to be like very esoteric, and it's about like little like word problems almost, and parsing out, well, in this scenario, do you have knowledge? Okay, but what about this scenario? And there's nothing wrong with that, but I don't think it's helpful for when you're like looking at that news article trying to decide, is this right or not? The way that epistemology used to work, like centuries ago, was that it was very much focused on intellectual, or you could say epistemic virtues, essentially developing virtuous patterns of thought and patterns of study. The three that I highlight in the book are studiousness and intellectual honesty and wisdom. And these are concerned with how we're searching for knowledge, how we're using it when we find it, how we're dealing with people who disagree with us, and with facts that, you know, don't go along with how we want things to be. And the unfortunate thing about intellectual virtues, or any virtues, is that you cannot simply decide to have them and then, you know, it's sort of there. That would be very handy.
Wouldn't it though?
That's not how it works in my experience.
I want to be more kind and gracious.
Right. And then just bam. It'd be great. Unfortunately, not how it works. And so the second side of this that I've talked about is that I think we can't sort of deliberately, quickly manufacture virtues in ourselves, but we can create habits that make it possible for them to grow. And so a lot of that goes back to what we were talking about earlier, ways that we are using our time, ways that we are, where we're putting our attention. And a lot of that, I think, begins with asking ourselves like some pretty hard questions about how we're using our time and attention right now. Even things like, you know, can you wash the dishes without listening to a podcast? Can you fold laundry without watching television? Like, are you able to read a book without looking at your phone between every chapter or every section? And I think the really embarrassing thing for a lot of us is that the answer to questions like that are no, and that our habits with technology and with, you know, just a constant flow of information, that we're not engaging deeply, we're not developing any real expertise of our own, we're just sort of skimming along, passively consuming, just sort of lapping up whatever flows our way. A lot of that is really dysfunctional for a lot of us, and out of control and ill-considered. It is not easy to change those habits, but I think that is where we have to start if we want to make it possible to develop those intellectual virtues, so that, again, there will never be a single rule that says like, okay, if you see this in some piece of political media, well, that's how you know it's false. But you could be the kind of person who is sort of has a feel for truth, the way you can feel different kinds of fabrics, right? Where it's not necessarily something you can explicitly describe. It's not something you can say, you can maybe easily communicate to someone else, but it's sort of that instinctive, almost pre-conscious feeling where something sort of feels off when you're encountering falsehood, or when you're encountering whether that's deliberate deception or just simple error, that an alarm bell would ring.
You have to be immersed in truth in order to see falsehood. We've had Justin early on the podcast. Mm-hmm. It's like scripture before phone is mm-hmm. like the first thing I teach my students now. It's like,
it's a fantastic rule.
Right. And so what are you doing? You need to fill your head with truth so you can start to see falsehood.
It's difficult to make these sort of like small recommendations and say, change your habits with this, read your scripture before phone, because you do it for a month or two and it's like, what is this doing? Like, is this doing anything? Like Twitter is still a cesspool. It doesn't make a difference whether I'm doing this or not. But I think if you are old enough to remember a time before when you were on the internet all day, every day, and you can probably remember that your brain worked differently then, that you could read for longer stretches, that the shape of your days was different. And that took time to develop. But now, after a decade or 2 decades, you see that marked difference. And so it seems like ineffective and daunting, and like you're not doing that much to start to try to reset your habits now. But hopefully, in another 10 or 20 years, you'll be able to look back and see a similarly dramatic change for the better.
Very good. It's a long obedience in the same direction. Thanks for being on the podcast, Bonnie. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you guys again for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bonnie. Hey, we just want to take a moment to say thank you. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Reintegrate Podcast. I'm David Lotney, and my co-host is Dr. Bob Robinson. This podcast is for you to help you reintegrate all of life. It's the two of us from our 2 generational perspectives. I'm in my 20s and Bob is in his 50s. We discuss with authors whose books help us to reintegrate our lives so that everything we think, feel, and do is integrated with our Christian faith. It would be helpful if you could leave a review for us to help others find the podcast, and tell your friends about it and share it on social media. Also, you can go to re-integrate.org to check out all the various resources available to you through the Reintegrate Ministry.